To recap what has happened so far up to this point, I have gone to this police station as an informant. I have had 3-year longitudinal access to systemic organised sexual exploitation of female minors. I have had my life threatened numerous times by multiple people. I am potentially in danger and my safety cannot be guaranteed. By coming to this police station today, I am putting myself at risk and I am here at great personal cost. I have a note in my pocket written in German, using terminology that the Wiener Polizei should be familiar with. The note is concise, efficient. It articulates and communicates the severity of the situation, the scope of the situation, and provides the relevant context that they need. I'm not reporting one crime in isolation. I'm reporting many crimes relative to organized criminality. I am here as an informant. I can provide all of the salient information. All information can be substantiated and corroborated through empirical evidence, which is documented, preserved, and I'm willing to transfer through a secure channel. My safety is not guaranteed, my life is potentially in danger. 30 minutes before coming to this police station, I had my life threatened by an adult male associated with the network of exploitation, and I wish to be provided with protection or reassurance in exchange for the information that I'm here today to relinquish to the appropriate authorities. I have been left to wait on the street for 40 minutes. My cortisol levels are spiking. I'm hypervigilant. I'm under immense psychological pressure. Eventually, an officer comes to the door. He's initially very nice to another civilian who is waiting to report a separate incident. He is amicable and shows empathy towards that other citizen. However, upon reading my note, he states, "Yes, but you will have to wait," and then aggressively slams the door in my face. There is a complete change in this officer's affect, which is noted by the other civilian, who is my witness to this incident. And so I wait outside this police station, my life potentially in danger. 50 minutes later, a second officer comes to the door. He has no prior knowledge of my note, who I am, why I'm there, and he asks how he can be of help to me. And so I have to start again. And so the first officer, despite the urgency of the note, despite the scope and severity of the context, upon returning back into the police station, fails to divulge or communicate this information to any of his colleagues, and that officer is never seen again. He is no longer seemingly present at this station. Furthermore, despite the note explicitly communicating that I'm potentially in danger, he also fails to communicate that to any of his colleagues. And so I'm left waiting outside for 50 minutes, not 15, 50. And so the second officer reads the note, and he returns inside the police station, leaving me outside for a further 30 minutes. The second officer eventually returns to the door, and he asks if he can once again read the note. And so I hand him the note, he reads it again, and proceeds to hand the note back to me. And it is at this point that I have to begin to communicate to the officers how to do their jobs. And I insist, please do not hand that note back to me, keep that note. Now this is procedural. That note should be immediately filed as evidence in of itself. As I've already explained, if I get cold feet, if I run away, they have documented evidence that at some point in time, somebody attempted to transfer information related to organized sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. If a victim further down the line comes to the police, there will exist corroborating evidence that somebody tried to alert them to this situation. Furthermore, the officers keep leaving and coming back to the door, asking to read the note again. They leave, they come back, ask to read the note again. Just for efficiency, they should keep the note. Take it with you inside the police station so that you don't have to keep returning to read it. The police officer looks very shocked and confused by my refusal to accept the note back and my insistence that he keep the note. But he acquiesces, he keeps the note, and he takes it with him. After 10-15 minutes or so, I can see that the second officer begins to converge with a female officer and a bald officer. The other officers, who are peripheral by this point, begin to leave, leaving only second officer, female officer, and bald officer. Now, intermittently, the female officer keeps looking up through the glass door outside to where I am stood, and therefore it is highly likely they were discussing me and what to do with me. But at this point, around 2 hours have elapsed. One officer has told a civilian who is potentially in danger to wait outside on the street. That officer thereafter has not communicated the situation to any of his colleagues, meaning the civilian is left on the street for 50 minutes for absolutely no reason, potentially increasing the risk of him being harmed. When the second officer eventually comes to the door and he's informed about the situation, he reads the note. He again leaves the civilian on the street, and then begins a chain of events where they're essentially coming back and forth to the door. We can see that there is confusion as to how to process this situation. This isn't a civilian coming to the station to report a crime in isolation. It's multiple crimes as part of a wider systemic organized criminal network. The police should be trained to deal with both, whether a civilian is reporting an isolated crime or a civilian is coming as an informant to report and expose systemic criminality. And yet we can observe that they're confused and they do not know what to do. Eventually, the female officer comes to the door and proceeds to ask me, "Do you know the names?" "Yes, I know everything." "Do you know locations?" "Yes, I know everything." "Okay, please wait." And she returns back inside the police station. She later returns to the door to ask me further questions. "Do you know this?" "Yes, I know everything." "Do you know that?" "Yes, I know everything." "Okay, please wait." And she goes back inside the police station. Over 2 hours have elapsed. A civilian potentially in danger is still waiting outside on the street after having his life threatened 30 minutes before initially coming to the police station. We can observe initial confusion as to how to process this, and by this point, the female officer coming to the door multiple times is essentially stalling. This is observable stalling. The note itself communicates efficiently that all information is known by the informant. And so coming to the door, asking him, does he know the names of victims, is obsolete. Asking him if he knows locations is obsolete. And she does this multiple times. The civilian is already under immense psychological pressure. There's so much stalling happening here. And now his integrity is being questioned. My anxiety is increasing. I feel like they're questioning the veracity of what I'm here to report. They're undermining what I'm here to report. And at this point, I genuinely consider running away and leaving. Now, if I had not insisted to that officer to keep the note, they would have no evidence that I was ever there. However, even if I did not know a specific location, it does not negate the rest of the information that I can potentially provide. Any information is information. And so they're looking for discrepancies so as to not welcome me into this station to give an interview to transfer this information. Yet, even if we remove the framing, which is that I'm an informant here to expose organized criminality, we would essentially be left with a civilian who's come to this police station because his life has been threatened imminently. And this isn't an isolated incident, this keeps happening to him. Therefore, this is a civilian in danger. So, returning to the door, consistently asking questions, do you know this, do you know that, should be completely irrelevant to the process. The process should be to get this person into the station as quickly as possible. In fact, upon initially reading the note, that I had had my life threatened should have outweighed the intelligence that I was there to transfer. So from the very initial interaction, the procedure should have been to get this civilian to safety as quickly as possible. Then we will worry about what he's here to report. So we've had an initial failure to coordinate and communicate that somebody has come to the station as an informant, but also their life is potentially in danger. They have been made to wait outside for 50 minutes before eventually a second officer comes to the door and the actual process begins. That in itself is serious misconduct. Second officer has then not known what to do in this situation, and the entire chain of events thereafter has been marked by confusion and poor coordination and inability to read the situation or follow correct procedure. It has then shifted into intentional stalling and essentially a power play between the police and the civilian in what appears to be a deliberate exercise in the intimidation of this informant so as to not welcome him into the station and process what it is he is there to report. Eventually, he is granted access to the station after well over 2 hours have elapsed. And you have to consider that this informant, this civilian, waiting outside of the police station, could have been stabbed and fatally injured within 5 minutes of being there. And he communicated efficiently that his life was potentially in danger and that he had had his life threatened 30 minutes before coming to this police station. Now, already so much has happened before I, as the civilian, the informant, has even been granted access to the station, and finally I'm now sat in an interview room. However, getting access to the interview room was problematic in of itself. So after finally being granted access to this police station and I walk inside, I immediately witness disorder. Firstly, I have been made to wait outside this door for over 2 hours. All communication with the several police officers involved in processing me up until that point were through the door. The door was being opened. The officers were poking their heads out of the door in order to communicate with me. However, to the right of the door is actually a window that opens. There's a little desk behind it, essentially to facilitate two-way communication between a civilian and a police officer who is presumably supposed to be sat on the other side of the window and manning that position. There is nobody sat there. Presumably this is a staffing issue, but that is the least of this station's worries, because as I walk inside the station, I immediately notice there is no actual office furniture. It's very basic, almost like crates that have been painted clinical white, and stacked onto these crates are monitors, and these crates are strewn everywhere. The monitors are just hastily thrown on top of them. There's cables running everywhere. The walls themselves are painted clinical white. There are no posters, there are no notices, nothing to reassure me as a civilian as to the legitimacy of this police station. It doesn't look like a police station, it does not feel like a police station. And suddenly the police officers' confusion is reframed relative to the environment in which they occupy. These officers are essentially a personification of the environment itself, chaotic. And so in order to access the interview room, I have to clamber over one of these makeshift desks with a monitor on top of it, and I nearly fall over. So the police station itself is actually, it's a fire hazard, but also it's a health and safety issue, and the public should not be allowed inside there. Imagine if I had tripped and I had fallen and injured myself. This police station is absolute chaos, from the environment itself to the officers who are employed to work there. This place is not functioning efficiently. So anyway, finally I'm now sat in an interview room. Officer number 2 sat opposite me, female officer stood in the corner to the right, and bald officer sat to the right behind a computer monitor. No officer has introduced themselves formally. I do not know the names of these officers or their identification numbers. Furthermore, no officer has explained to me the chain of command, the procedure, what is happening, and I am extremely confused by this point. Officer number 1 and then female officer being overtly passive-aggressive toward me. And despite coming to this police station to do the right thing, both morally, ethically, and legally, I am already being made to feel like a burden, or like a problem for even being there. And that is a serious red flag. The fact that I do not feel welcome at this station. Furthermore, because my safety is still yet to be guaranteed, I'm the one having to be pragmatic by thinking downstream what's going to happen afterwards, and so I turn to the female officer. I ask her if she knows when the last train from Vienna to Bratislava, Slovakia is, so that I have an escape route out of the country where my safety will be guaranteed. She's very hostile and passive-aggressive when I ask, excuse me, do you know when is the last train from Vienna Hauptbahnhof to Bratislava, Slovakia is?
What? Sorry?
Just so aggressive with me. But she responds by saying that she will find out for me. Ultimately, she does not find out for me, so I'm not offered protection, but in trying to secure my own protection myself, and I'm asking for very little at this point, simply, will you be able to find out the time of the final train from your district, which you should really know? She fails to even provide that. And so anyway, I'm there in the interview. The interview itself begins with a procedural failure. Officer number 2, who I assume is conducting, but I don't know, because nobody has explained the process to me, tells me to talk what's going on. Now, this officer has already been provided with the context. He knows the situation. Therefore, he knows in this situation to be asking specific questions in order to elicit specific information that he will need. Because the last thing that you want is for an informant who is emotionally involved to contaminate evidence and information with his own narrative. Now, I, as the informant, say this to him: should you not ask me specific questions, so as to extract only the salient information that you will need without me going on tangents, inadvertently introducing informational convolution? But he insists, no, just talk. Now, this is not correct procedure. Furthermore, the context is explicitly stated efficiently. Given the context and the scope of the situation, the person conducting the interview should be exploitation informed. And if they are not, they should defer to somebody who specializes in sexual exploitation to conduct this interview. Somebody who understands trauma-driven psychology, grooming dynamics, mechanisms, trajectories, but that does not happen. This officer who does not specialize in any of these areas is conducting the interview. And this is extremely problematic, and you're about to find out why. So first of all, I begin talking, but I don't know who I should be addressing. I don't know where I should be looking. There's 3 officers in this room. Officer 2 sat opposite, adjacent to me. Female officer is stood in the corner to the right. And then we have bald officer to the right of me behind a computer monitor. I do not know if his presence is even relevant to the interview. Is his presence relative to contextual workflow, or is he busy working on some separate case? Is that just his desk where he sits? I don't know, because nobody has explained to me what is happening. But I begin talking. Initially, I feel very comfortable and secure in the fact that the female officer is present. Why? Well, because she is a female. She is going to be able to empathize and relate to what it is that I'm communicating. She's a female herself. She'll be able to discern and understand what it is I'm talking about when I describe these vulnerable, underage female minors being sexually exploited. Bald officer, I also feel secure in his presence because I just assume that he is there logging what it is that I'm communicating onto an internal system. That is why he is sat behind this workstation, behind this monitor. But I'm unsure if that is why he's sat there. However, occasionally, as I'm describing incidents, behaviors, criminality that I have witnessed, he looks up at me from behind his monitor. Now, he doesn't look up at me dismissively, as if I'm talking nonsense, as if I'm wasting police time. He looks up at me in response to specific information that I communicate, and he looks shocked. He looks very concerned by what it is that I'm saying. So I just, again, assume, this is being taken seriously, he must be logging what I'm saying. He must be relevant to this interview process. Now, because officer number 2, who I had begun to recognize was most likely the one conducting the interview, because he had told me to simply talk, this essentially presented me with the difficult task of knowing where to start. There's 1,000 different places in which I could start, 1,000 different ways that I could try and communicate everything that I have been exposed to, which is, again, why the officer should have specific questions to ask me in order to avoid this. So for the first 10 minutes of the interview, I'm struggling to know where to start with this story, at what angle to come in at, and the burden is on me to somehow parse all of this information and organize the complexity in a way that is metabolic, digestible, efficient, and ultimately only communicates the salient information that they will need. After 10 to 15 minutes, I'm beginning to organize everything, and my communication is becoming more efficient. My competence begins to reveal itself. For example, I begin to discuss grooming mechanisms, grooming trajectories. I begin to model the grooming pipeline and provide micro to macro level detailing of the operational functionality of this model. And I begin to risk assess the female victims themselves, cumulative risk stack, present risk profiles. I begin to reveal that I am trauma informed. I understand all the psychological drivers. Essentially, it becomes apparent that this guy knows exactly what he's talking about. This is not a civilian who's been witness to one isolated incident, or maybe 2 or 3 isolated incidents. This is a civilian who has witnessed hundreds of incidents, longitudinally, temporally, but also possesses the ability to think in system architecture, pattern observation. He is educated in these specific areas, therefore, not only can he discern what's happening, he's able to communicate what is happening, how it is happening, why it is happening. So when usually the police are presented with fragments Because, of course, organized criminality, sexual exploitation is compartmentalized. People only see aspects of it. This is somebody who somehow has been able to see all of the picture all at once. But also, he knows exactly what to do with it. He knows exactly what he's witnessed. He knows exactly how to explain it, how to communicate it. So, for example, if you go get an independent clinician, a psychotherapist, a trauma-informed specialist, sexual exploitation-informed specialist, they would be able to validate the legitimacy of the psychology that I'm using, the grooming dynamics and mechanisms that I'm trying to explain. But I don't introduce myself by saying that I can do any of these things. I'm just talking, and it becomes intrinsically apparent through the information that I'm disclosing that I do know what I'm talking about, and that I am psychologically literate, and that I do specialize myself in sexual exploitation. And as this competence becomes apparent, suddenly female officer leaves, followed shortly after by bald officer. So at this point, I recognize, so this interview is not being formally logged. Whatever bald officer was doing, even if it was relevant to this procedure, it no longer is. So whether or not bald officer's presence was relative or was relevant to the interview process, either way, it no longer is because he's gone. And so at this point, I recognize that this interview is not being formally logged or documented onto an internal server where it can be accessed by, for example, sexual exploitation specialists, other units such as the KJH and Kinderschutz, Child and Welfare. There is no dictaphone on the table. It's not being recorded. And I'm just left with officer number 2. And this is where things become profoundly disturbing, because it appears as though officer number 2 has been tasked with dismissing me through minimization, compression, and reframing of criminality as legal. So I then begin to explain the interpersonal dynamics between the victims. For example, 2 of the victims, student E and student N, are in a highly enmeshed dyad. Now basically, dyadic enmeshment is a specific type of codependency between the 2 subjects within the dyad. They co-regulate, they feel that they cannot survive psycho-emotionally without the other. The subjects outsource reality testing to one another. Each other's individual issues are amplified thereafter. It creates an echo chamber. Agencies are relinquished to one another. It's extremely dangerous because this creates cognitive dissonance, cognitive distortion. There is no external reality testing, therefore, when both subjects in a dyad are confirming each other's reality, their perceptions of reality can become distorted. They're extremely dangerous, which is why teachers, pastoral officers, safeguarding officers in schools are trained to observe and discern dyadic enmeshment. And of course, this gets into a different territory, which is the school's failure, the education system's failure to recognize any of the issues of these 2 females during the 7 years in which they have been within the school system and under their supervision and duty of care. But ultimately, in an enmeshed dyad, you usually have one subject who is dominant and one who is subordinate, and that is the case here. Student E is subordinate and student N is dominant. Now, the local bar is within a 10-minute walk of the local high school. Within an hour of leaving the school gates, these females are at the bar intoxicated, having transactional sex with the bartenders in exchange for the provision of strong alcoholic beverages, and they've been doing so since the age of 14, 15. Because these 2 females are on a trajectory, a late-stage escalating grooming curve, which I talk about in my other videos, if you're interested in understanding how this form of grooming works. However, what I communicated to the officer was that student N, in this grooming-adjacent environment, the local bar, which is the centralized node of the wider system of sexual exploitation, student N is leveraging student E's body and sexuality in order to access this adult social environment. There's multiple reasons for this. A, student E is more conventionally attractive and therefore more appealing to the men. B, when risk assessing student E and cumulative risk stacking, student E is exceptionally more vulnerable and therefore more exploitable than student N. And point C, student E is Serbian, and virtually all of the men involved in this closed-loop system of sexual exploitation are Serbian or Balkan origin, but mostly Serbian. So this is ethnic-targeted grooming. But essentially, the men want student E. Now, student N is leveraging student E for access to this adult social space, and thereafter adult status and the adult privilege that comes with it. And an example that I gave the officer was that student E had disclosed that when she was in the bar, drunk, student N came up behind her, grabbed her breasts without permission, jiggled them in order to arouse the 50s, 60s, 70-year-old men who were at the bar with them, so that they would buy student E strong alcoholic beverages that student N would then benefit from indirectly. If student E is bought alcoholic beverages, by relation, student N receives alcoholic beverages. I mean, firstly, student E is intoxicated, and this is unsolicited body contact. So student N has essentially sexually assaulted student E. But we can see that she is leveraging student E's body and her appeal to these men in order to extract alcoholic beverages through student E. Furthermore, student N is displacing all sexual risk onto student E, because thereafter, student E is the one who has to go to the customer restroom facilities and engage in sexual activity with the bartenders or the associated male patrons within this closed loop of grooming and sexual exploitation to repay them for the provision of the alcoholic beverages. For example, I have a quote from student E here, and student E says, "I had to have sex with a bartender in the customer restroom facility, the toilet, because I did not have any money for my drinks." Student N is not engaging sexually with the bartenders, with any of the men involved. All sexual risk is being displaced onto student E. Now, this is peer facilitated grooming, which actually occurs more often than it does not in grooming adjacent environments. Now, Officer 2 motions with his finger to essentially move on. And then he verbalizes this by saying, yeah, move on, get to the point. Now, this is shocking because arguably this is one of the most salient pieces of information that he will receive. Why? Because when extracting victims of sexual exploitation from the grooming adjacent environments, it is very important to know about the interpersonal dynamics between the victims, because if you have a female who is essentially parasitic and coercive, and that female is dominant in an enmeshed dyad, then that female can begin to minimize, close down, encourage, in this case, student E, to remain quiet or to reframe things as choice, agency, and therefore extricating these females together and providing them with clinical or psychotherapeutic care that they will need in order to recover. If they weight the risk of each female equally, and they're extracted together and provided incremental rehabilitation together, you could actually potentially cause more psychological damage in doing so. And so knowing and understanding the interpersonal dynamics between the victims themselves is so important for iatrogenic risk mitigation, which is essentially avoiding causing further psychological harm in trying to provide them with psychological care. So it's absolutely appalling that this officer does not feel it is relevant. He is clearly not psychologically illiterate. He clearly does not specialize in sexual exploitation. However, he doesn't need to be psychologically literate or specialize in sexual exploitation. That is fine. This is above his pay grade. But that is why he should defer to somebody who is specializing in these areas. And as soon as they received my note and they were provided with the context, procedurally, the first thing that they should have done is consider consulting somebody who specializes in sexual exploitation cases. And yet, they failed to do so. However, for redundancy and to avoid single point failure, they could have had an officer logging this information into an internal system, which is what I assumed Bald Officer was doing. So thereafter, somebody who is specialized in sexual exploitation, somebody who is trauma-informed, specialized units or other systems such as Child and Youth Welfare, the KGH, Kinderschutz, or even the school psychologists, would thereafter have been able to access this information, and they would have immediately recognized, peer-facilitated grooming within dyadic enmeshment and the presence of a dominant, coercive female peer. It is so important that we know this when strategizing our approaching of and ultimately extrication of these females from within this grooming adjacent environment. But no, this officer, he just dismissed it, said, yeah, get to the point. And so I do. I explained to the officer that from the ages 14 to 15, these females, and there's around half a dozen that I can place both at the local high school and at this local bar simultaneously. Student E, Student N, Student D, Student V, Student L, and so on. Student E is the one that I have the largest data set for that is available to analyze. And also student E is the one at most critical risk in terms of stratification. We have student E who's at critical risk. We would have student N at high risk. etc. So that is why I often reference student E. Anyway, I explained that between 14, 15 to the ages of 16, their presence at this bar does not involve any sexual activity. They're essentially drinking at the bar, no ID checks. The bartenders are providing strong alcoholic beverages to these females. Completely gratis, that is free. Now, I did not explain this to him, but for anybody listening to this who specializes in sexual exploitation, perhaps you work for the KGH or a specialized sexual exploitation unit. Between 15 to 16, this is essentially an observational period. There is no sexual activity, the girls are just being provided with strong alcoholic beverages, gratis. And this serves multiple functions. A, it normalizes these females' presence within an adult social environment. B, it normalizes the presence of adult men around these females, which incrementally erodes their boundaries and their perception of danger. And then point C, it is an observational period in which the bartenders can risk stack cumulatively and assess exploitability. So with regards to student E, sexually abused as a child, 7 years prior, as she enrolled at the high school, and this childhood sexual trauma has never been addressed, which leaves her susceptible to exploitation through trauma reenactment, which is corroborated by student E's extreme hypersexuality. This is the psyche's survival mechanism, basically to reframe sexual exploitation and abuse as choice, agency, and empowerment, to convince the victim, don't worry, you're in control of this. But ultimately, they're not in control. But I digress. Student has been alcohol dependent since age 14, using alcohol both as an emotional suppressant but also as a social lubricant. Her domestic living is split between two residences, her mother's apartment and her grandmother's apartment, which is exceptionally unstable for such a critical period in this adolescent's formative development. At her mother's residence, she is the victim of sibling domestic abuse. For example, her brother threw glass at her feet, it cut open her feet severely. She stayed thereafter at her grandmother's apartment for a week, but regularly she sleeps at her grandmother's apartment rather than her actual permanent residence, her mother's apartment, to get away from the domestic abuse, but also because student E states that she cannot relate to her mother, she cannot communicate to her mother about her emotions because her mother is emotionally unavailable. But what her mother does to compensate for this is she leaves money around the house. So 100 euros on the table, 100 to 200 euros on the kitchen worktop, and then this money is being used thereafter to go out drinking in the adult social environment or to purchase alcohol that will be consumed at home in her bedroom. Furthermore, this female is not learning the value of money and where money comes from, but she's also learning that money equals care. So she struggles to recognize emotional care. Emotional care does not make this female feel secure, safe, wanted, loved. However, being given money, being paid for sex, being taken on shopping sprees by adult men, all of this sexual attention makes her feel wanted and needed, and so she's perceiving money as care. This leaves her exceptionally vulnerable to something called transactionalization, where essentially the female's value system is replaced with a value system where everything is dependent on money. So you take me on a shopping spree, you buy me gifts, or I'll have sex with you, but you give me money. And this is how young, vulnerable females are ultimately psychologically conditioned to engage in prostitution. Lastly, student E is in a highly enmeshed dyad where she is the subordinate and her agency is virtually completely outsourced to student N, who she relies on for psycho-emotional survival, survival within a school environment, but ultimately all reality testing. And when you consider that student N is leveraging student E's sexuality for access to the adult social environment, the local bar, and student E is relying on student N for reality testing and confirmation, and we can see that student N is just going to validate all of this high-risk sexual activity because, of course, she benefits indirectly from it. We can see that cumulatively, student E is exceptionally vulnerable and exploitable. Now, that is what these men, the bartenders at the local bar, are doing between age 15 to 16, where the girls are just drinking alcohol there for free. They're being provided strong alcohol for free. It's a period of observation and cumulative risk stacking to assess their exploitability. Now, all of these things I mentioned are things that the school should have noted during the 7 years in which these students have been within their system. And yet they have failed to do so. They probably have made notes regarding certain behavioral issues, but they haven't connected the wider pattern. So they've failed. Safeguarding has failed catastrophically, and yet these bartenders, these men engaging in predation who are not educated, who are not familiar with safeguarding scaffolding or framework, or cumulative risk stacking, but they're doing it efficiently and correctly. And yet the school, the safeguarding framework, has failed to do this. Now, I did not communicate this to the police officer, or maybe I alluded to it, but it's just for anybody who's listening who is specializing in sexual exploitation, or perhaps you're a trauma-informed psychologist. But essentially, this is the grooming trajectory. Now, it's called late-stage grooming escalation curve, and this is because it escalates incrementally. So around the 16th birthdays of these vulnerable young children, schoolgirls, minors, we expect the introduction of sexual elements, sexual activity, and indeed that happens. As the females turn 16, the alcoholic beverages are no longer provided to them by the bartenders for free. They're provided to the females with the expectation that sexual services will be leveraged in order to repay them. So this is the start of transactionalization. So the females have acclimated to this adult social space over the period of a year. They're completely isolated from their female friends, from their female peers. For the past year, they've socialized exclusively after school with adult men. There's no female oversight, it's adult men. These females are isolated, but they just don't realize it. Once they leave those school gates, they're surrounded by adult men, and that is their social life. And of course, when they're at school, student E and student N are isolated just to one another in this enmeshed dyad. So they're not socializing with their female peers at school, and then outside of school, their entire social life is adult men. And this has been normalized. And then by age 16, access to the adult social space and thereafter adult status and adult privilege is being leveraged to keep these girls within orbit of the grooming adjacent environment. These are young underage females on the cusp of adulthood. A bar has alcohol. It provides access to adult status and privilege. All of these things are very enticing to young females who are not quite adults yet, but want access to adult status, which is why bars often become the centralized hubs of wider systemic grooming operations. And this is a model recognized across Europe. Any grooming-informed specialists listening to this will recognize it immediately. But essentially, by this point, the young females are hooked. They've tasted what it's like to have adult status and adult privilege. The bartenders are now introducing sexual elements. You can still drink here, you can still have access to this adult privilege and status, but there needs to be some kind of repayment here. And so, upon being provided with these strong alcoholic beverages, once intoxicated, the females, for example, student E, will go to the customer restroom facilities of this bar and repay the specific bartender with sexual services. And this thereafter happens frequently. Every single bartender has had sexual relations with student E on rotation, usually in the customer restroom facility or on private spaces elsewhere on the premises of this local bar. Now, this is in the 22nd district of Wien. The local high school is essentially acting as a feeder of vulnerable and exploitable young females to this bar, which is a grooming pipeline. The reason the school is a feeder is because its safeguarding infrastructure is failing, as I've already pointed out. It failed to risk, stack, and assess the vulnerability of its female students, even though they had 7 years to do so, to make observations, to take notes, to create vectors that can be blown up to map on incidents and recognize patterns. They failed to do this. So anyway, you have the provision of strong alcohol to female minors, and thereafter they're repaying the bartenders with sexual services in the toilets, with student E quoted as saying, "I had to have sex with the bartender because I didn't have money for drinks." Now, upon telling officer number 2 about this, he responds through minimization and reframing. So he responds by saying, "Oh, well, there's nothing we can do because, like, technically minors can drink alcohol if XYZ. Now, legally, a minor can drink a certain type of alcohol, however, not strong alcohol. So this police officer, initially, he needs to determine what kind of alcohol is being provided to the females, and he can very quickly establish that it's strong alcohol, spirits. This is entirely illegal. But instead, he defaulted to, well, certain type of alcohol is legal, therefore there is nothing wrong here, we can't do anything." Yet this officer has the context being that these girls are essentially plied with strong alcohol. When they are intoxicated, adult males are having sexual intercourse with them. This is sexual intercourse with underage females holding minor status. after initially plying them with the strong alcohol to inebriate them in the first place. Now he can see that. He's already been told that they're being provided with strong alcohol, yet his answer is, well, there's nothing illegal there because there are certain types of alcohol that they can drink, so nothing we can do. So that is blatant minimization and reframing. Anyway, shortly before their 17th birthdays, we would expect activity to increase again because this is an escalating grooming curve. And it does. So in the case of student E, she's introduced to a controlled substance, cocaine. And we do expect for cocaine to be introduced somewhere between the age of 16 to 17 on this grooming curve. Why? Well, because cocaine serves to emotionally blunt victims of sexual exploitation and increase their impulsivity and risk-taking in environments where sexual exploitation is occurring. Now again, if this interview is being logged and therefore it was accessible on an internal system, somebody who specializes in sexual exploitation will recognize that immediately. Furthermore, around the time of their 17th birthdays, for example, a student E, shortly before her 17th birthday, activity begins to move away from the bar environment itself to the private apartments of elder associated males of the bar, whom she's introduced to. So the initial bar staff are between 30 to 50 years of age. These elder associates are 60, 70 years of age. So she's driven from the bar to the private apartments of elder men associated with the bar. Now this is multiple men. Student E is going to multiple apartments of multiple elder men with one common denominator. All of these elder men are associated with the bar. She meets them at the bar. Now, upon returning to their private apartments, she's offered cocaine, champagne, and immediate travel out of the country between Austria and Serbia. Multiple different men, all with the same MO. Upon meeting these females, immediately offering flight between Vienna and Belgrade in Serbia. And one common denominator, they're all associated with the local bar in the 22nd district of Wien. Now, that is clear structure. This is a 16-year-old female whom they do not know, but they're offering immediate travel out of the country. That constitutes trafficking. This is sex trafficking. Especially when one of the perpetrators, upon student E returning back to his private apartment, states, I want to fly you to Serbia to have sex with my entire village and even my own father. That's essentially perpetrator confession. I want to fly you out of this country to another country for the purpose of sexual exploitation and prostitution. Now, officer number 2, upon being told this by me, responds by saying, well, there's nothing we can do. The age of consent is 14. And so, if she's got her parents' permission, if these girls have got parents' permission, there's nothing that we can do. Now, anybody listening to this immediately will be thinking, wait, it's highly unlikely these females have their parents' permission. Logically, it's very unlikely the parents even know. And that's why it's so disturbing that this police officer's philosophical bent, his default was to assume, well, they'll probably have parents' permission, therefore, we're not going to do anything. We can't do anything. The age of consent is 14. They probably have parents' permission. Nothing we can do. Immediately, he should be thinking, it's very unlikely that these females have parents' permission or the parents' knowledge of what's happening. This is serious. Furthermore, it's clear trafficking, but when you have a perpetrator stating his intent that I want to fly you to Serbia for the purpose of sexual exploitation and prostitution, it's framing it as sex trafficking. And this is multiple men, all with the same modus operandi. For example, a 60-year-old male, upon taking student E from the bar back to his private apartment, presented her with champagne, cocaine, and even wanted a photograph with her. And yes, we do have that photographic evidence, which is exceptionally incriminating. We have a 16-year-old child in the private apartment of a 60-year-old male, his face pressed up against hers. There is cocaine and there's a bottle of champagne, and then the caption from the female herself says, he's just booked me on a flight to Serbia, he's rich. A plane ticket from Vienna International Airport to Belgrade International Airport was actually purchased for this underage female. But Officer 2 responds by saying, there is nothing we can do, age of consent is 14, with parents' permission, it's not illegal. And so he's minimized, compressed, instrumentalized the age of consent in order to dismiss this entirely. So moving on. I explained to him how after their 17th birthdays, the high-risk sexual activity, as we would expect on this grooming curve, escalates. And so the females are taken on shopping sprees regularly in the 22nd district, upon which they have their hair and nails paid for, and they're bought stiletto shoes, lingerie, and jewelry. Now, the officer responds by saying, there's nothing we can do, bro. Age of consent is 14. If these girls want to go with their sugar daddies, nothing we can do. Now in this case, under Austrian law, it's not illegal for a 16, 17-year-old female to go on shopping sprees with an elder adult male. However, this is grooming adjacent behavior, and when we have the wider context, and that this behavior, which is not illegal in itself, is adjacent to actual criminal behavior, for example, the provision of cocaine to a child, attempted sex trafficking of a child, it is substantiating evidence. And yet he once again instrumentalizes the age of consent being 14 to dismiss it. And so we move on, and I explain to him, well, as they turn 17, the females, for example, student E, is taken to hotel rooms. She's transported from the local bar to hotel rooms with multiple men per session. This is group sex, after which she's paid directly in currency. Now, of course, he responds by saying, there's nothing we can do. The age of consent is 14 in Austria, bro. If we go to the girls and we ask them, do you want this? And the girls respond, yes, this is our choice, we want this. There's nothing we can do, bro. However, he's just undermining completely what grooming is and how it works psychologically. But in Austria, the framework exists to protect females from exactly this, sexual exploitation and grooming. If you had consulted a specialist in sexual exploitation, or you had got somebody from the KGH or Kinderschutz involved, as you should have done, they would recognize all of this immediately. However, what he's doing here is instrumentalizing the age of consent in order to legalize what is happening. However, in doing so, he is constantly contravening other existing Austrian laws. For example, this underage female is taken to hotel rooms for group sex, after which she's paid directly in currency. So suddenly, this becomes prostitution. This is transactional sex where currency is involved. It's prostitution. Because this female holds minority status, she's a child essentially, it constitutes underage prostitution by relation, child prostitution. That is exceptionally criminal under Austrian law, but also EU jurisdiction. The age of consent does not legitimize transactional sex. Once this sex becomes transactional, and once there is obvious prostitution of a female minor, the police no longer have to go ask that female, do you consent to this? Consent is completely irrelevant. By law, the police have to intervene when adult men are engaging in transactional sex with a minor. So responding to me by saying, there is nothing that we can do, the age of consent is 14, is a blatant instrumentalization of the age of consent in order to minimize, reframe this as legal, ultimately to dismiss what I am saying. However, consent is completely irrelevant here. This is underage prostitution. There is the transference of currency in exchange for sex. The police do not need consent to intervene. Legally, you have to intervene. It is child prostitution. Now, at this point in the interview, the officer is slumped back in his chair. He's flexing. This is a power play. He's looking to his right, the door on the left of the room, to see what is happening outside of the room. What are my colleagues doing? So he's not even paying attention to me at this point. His eyes are looking all over the place. He's dissociating. Now, given the context and the severity of the situation, the fact that he's clearly disinterested, and this is expressed through his body language, is of course disturbing. But he then proceeds to get out a vape and vapes in front of me as a witness to crimes, as an informant here to report and expose serious organized criminal activity involving the sexual exploitation of children. He gets out a vape and proceeds to vape in front of me. Even if we remove the framing, we completely remove the context, and let's just suppose that I'm there to report some low-level crime, a neighbor trespassing on my property, you still expect absolute professionalism from an officer of the law. What you do not expect is an officer of the law to slump back in his chair and proceed to get out a vape and smoke in front of you. It is absolutely disgraceful, but the fact that the context is you have an informant in your interrogation room. He has had his life threatened multiple times, including 30 minutes before coming to this police station. He's trying to correctly transfer high salience, highly sensitive information regarding ongoing active sexual exploitation and attempted sex trafficking of children, your own underage female citizens that you're supposed to be protecting, and you get out a vape and start vaping in front of that witness to crimes. It goes beyond disgraceful. It is utterly, utterly disgusting, and is nothing more than power play. His whole body language throughout this interview, and now the vape, it is a power play. The guy is literally flexing in front of me. From the very beginning of this entire process, it has been marked by incompetence, complacency, but now we also have intent to minimize, reframe, and dismiss. And in doing so, in instrumentalizing the age of consent in order to legalize and legitimize obvious criminal activity involving minors, he's contravening so many other existing Austrian laws under EU jurisdiction. This officer is literally breaking the law. So when the act of coming to a police station to report serious organized criminality becomes criminal in itself, this creates a serious problem. And so you may be thinking, well, you've been exposed to one specific grooming pipeline. Even if that pipeline is collapsed down, the perpetrators are prosecuted, this is still probably prevalent across Vienna and to an extent Austria. Yes, however, in trying to report and expose this, I have uncovered serious failings in multiple systems, the KJH, education, safeguarding, and now the Polizei, which is why I'm making these videos. Because if all of these holes, all of these failings are actually recognized, addressed, and rectified, because this is institutional, in practice this can prevent other vulnerable young females, perhaps in the 10th district of Wien, in the 18th district, or perhaps in Salzburg, or, I don't know, Graz. It can prevent other vulnerable young females from slipping through the cracks, because this is no longer just an isolated grooming pipeline. This is a state institutional problem. The KJH, Kinderschutz, the Polizei, these systems are failing catastrophically. And so anyway, this officer's vaping in front of me. Once again, he reiterates, nothing we can do, age of consent is 14 in Austria, bro. He then tries to conclude the interview. He says to me, you have not specified the bar, the name of the bar, the location, or given me the names of the females. So he provides me with a scrap piece of paper. This is not official Polizei office stationery. This is a scrap piece of paper that he's just pulled from a notepad. And so I write down the names of victims, various locations, the bar, the local high school, some of the salient information, and I hand it to him. Now this is high salience, high sensitive information that needs to be logged into their internal system immediately. And yet, it just goes straight into this one officer's pocket. And judging by the tone of all officers involved, but especially this officer's tone, affect, and body language, it would not be unreasonable to suggest that it went straight into a bin. Now, the officer says to me, right, what we're going to do is we'll probably just send a plainclothed officer to the local saloon bar, order a glass of water, look around and see what he can see. You know, it's not going to be like in the movies. We're not going to be spying through the windows with binoculars. Okay, so this is absolutely outstanding. This officer has really outdone himself this time. So, firstly, you're going to send a plainclothed officer into a bar to order water and look around. That is not highly suspicious at all, is it? They're not going to instantly recognize narc. The second point is, what is he hoping to achieve? If he goes in there for 30 minutes, has a look around, he could miss some vulnerable young schoolgirls by 30 minutes. He could miss them by 2 hours. He could miss them by a day. Even if they're there in that moment, what exactly is he going to establish? They've been provided alcohol illegally. We're just going to give the bar a caution, escort the girls out of the bar. How is that enough to be able to build a case? Lastly, the fact that he patronizes me by stating it's not like in the movies, we're not going to go spying through the windows with binoculars. Well, firstly, I know you're not going to do that, because you've spent this whole process trying to dismiss me, trying to minimize. You clearly don't want to expend any resources having to investigate any of this. So I never thought that sending a team with binoculars to stake out this bar and gather intelligence was ever in consideration, because we can clearly see that you don't want to expend any resources whatsoever. But furthermore, clearly I'm the one who knows the process and how this should work. I'm the one who's had to communicate several times how you should do your job, and yet you're patronizing me, telling me it's not like in the movies. I know it's not like in the movies, which is why I'm here, trying to report through the appropriate channels. I've done absolutely everything correctly. You don't need to go spying through windows with binoculars. You have enough evidence here to start a case, and thereafter an investigation. You don't need to go looking through any windows. You've got so much empirical evidence here that I'm in possession of, and I'm wanting to transfer to you through a safe and secure channel. And then I ask him, so what about my evidence? And he's like, no, bro, no, we don't need that. We don't need that. So you literally have one of the victims claiming that she was raped in the customer restroom facility of this bar, and you don't want that evidence. You have photographic evidence of these females in the private apartments of these elder adult men holding up champagne. There's cocaine, there's confessions, statements. He's just put me onto a flight. You don't want any of this. Oh, no, bro, we don't need it. This is misconduct beyond anything I've ever seen in my life. They should take that evidence immediately. They don't need to send any officer to that bar to have a look around. They have enough evidence here to build a case and launch an investigation. And yet, he claims they do not want or need it. Once again, age of consent is 14, bro, nothing we can do. Yet, you have a 16-year-old female in November of 2024 in the customer toilet facilities of this bar claiming, I think I was raped by this guy. He was so aggressive with me. Where is the consent? But also, several days later, reframing it. Oh, actually, I think I liked it. Yeah, I think maybe it's just my kink. That is trauma reenactment. That is a victim psychologically reframing clear sexual exploitation and abuse as choice and empowerment for psychological survival. If you go inform a trauma-informed specialist, an exploitation-informed specialist, which is what you should have done, you will recognize this immediately. Go get a psychologist here. Go get somebody here who specializes in grooming and sexual exploitation. Go get somebody from the KGH down here. All of these people will validate exactly what I'm saying, the psychological drivers, but also the grooming mechanisms. And procedurally, that is what you're supposed to be doing. And talking of procedure, I had to tell him, stop. I don't need to know what you're going to do. You shouldn't have to tell me that. When taking witness statements or interviewing informants, if you do not minimize, if you do not compress, if you do not reframe, if you do not dismiss, if you treat this with the utmost respect and professionalism, then the witness, the informant, they do not need to know what you're going to do. They will take reassurance from your professionalism and they will trust the procedure and the process and that you know what to do. You do not have to turn around at the end of an interview and state what you're going to do in order to provide reassurance that you're going to do something, because the witness, the informant, will be able to assess from the situation how seriously you're taking it. And if you do it correctly, they will be assured by your competence and that this is being taken seriously. So I had to tell him, stop. I don't want to know what you're going to do. I mean, the whole procedure here should be based around the principle of containment. Now, the reason it's so incompetent that he's telling me what they're likely going to do is that there's a breach of containment. For example, I know what you're going to do. Thereafter, I can go out and I can contaminate an entire police investigation. I can jeopardize your operations because you just told me what you're planning to do. So we have this whole sequence of events is marked by confusion, incompetence, then complacency, then blatant stalling, then blatant intent to minimize, reframe, and dismiss. And now you have containment leakage. You have procedural containment leakage. Most of the information that's been transferred is high salience, but literally all of it has been dismissed through reframing and minimization. None of this has been formally logged into an internal system. Already, I've counted well over 100 contraventions of Austrian law, of police procedure, police guidelines, and we have blatant intent to dismiss through minimization and instrumentalization of the age of consent incorrectly in order to legitimize and legalize blatantly criminal activity. So this has now gone into the territory of corruption. It is just absolutely astounding that this is happening in the capital of one of the most developed nations in Europe, certainly the most developed in Central Europe. And it culminates with me having to write the most sensitive information, which is the names of the victims, perpetrators, and the locations, the school, on a scrap piece of paper that goes into this one officer's pocket, the very same officer who has shown throughout the interview that he's completely incompetent, complacent, but also an intent to minimize, reframe, and dismiss, ergo corruption. It's gone straight into his pocket. It is absolutely shocking. And all of the empirical evidence, it's not even transferred. No, we don't need it, we don't want it. Now, I leave the interview room, and there's two Polizei stood outside with huge rifles. Because that's not intimidating. There's no other officer in the station anymore. Just me and officer number 2 with his vape. And I walk outside, and there are these two officers with rifles. At this point, because I'm full of cortisol, adrenaline, because I'm under such psychological pressure, because my safety has not been guaranteed, I can't even stop to process what's just happened to me. It took me 3-4 days for this interview to start catching up with me, for me to be able to process it, integrate what happened. But I left the police station and I immediately fled. I had to go catch a train to Bratislava, flee Austria, to Slovakia for my own personal safety, because these guys had not even considered that this is a human being in our state who's had threats toward his life. In fact, I did mention it during the interview, and the officer simply said, "Was a weapon drawn?" And I said, "No, it wasn't drawn." "Oh, well, there's nothing we can do because the weapon wasn't drawn." Now, I have clearly communicated that I've been threatened multiple times, my life, my mortality, by multiple people. If this was, for example, a threat made by somebody I had a prior relationship with, he could maybe dismiss it as relational, it's an empty threat. However, when the context is that I'm here reporting serious organized sexual exploitation of female minors, it suddenly reframes any threats against my life as most likely serious. And likewise, the fact that I'm having my life threatened corroborates what it is I'm here to report, that I've had internal access over 3 years to systemic organized grooming and exploitation of female minors, including attempted sex trafficking and child prostitution. And yet he insists, was a weapon drawn? No? Well, we can't do anything. It is absolutely disgraceful. And I even explained to him, this is after months and months of online harassment, cyber surveillance, targeted character assassination attempts against witnesses, threats against the families of witnesses. Was a weapon drawn? Nothing we can do. These are citizens of your state making threats toward the life of somebody, both physically and when he's in a remote location, digitally. These threats are coming from within your state by citizens of your state. Was a weapon drawn? No? Well, nothing we can do. It's absolutely astounding, and I had to flee the country of Austria to Slovakia to secure my own safety. Now, of course, I'm inferring misconduct, intent, corruption. But if we actually stop objectively, stand back and look at what's being reported and consider that all claims that I make are corroborated through empirical evidence, exceptionally incriminating evidence that the Polizei rejected, the fact that every single thing that I reported has been rejected, not one single thing landed, yet we know objectively how much blatant criminality has occurred, the fact that everything reported in this interview was reframed and ultimately dismissed, we can see that this is clear intent to conceal. For example, he constantly instrumentalized the age of consent being 14. Therefore, we can't do anything. However, the age of consent does not legitimize the provision of cocaine to a child. The age of consent does not legitimize transactional sex, essentially child prostitution. Consent is irrelevant. The police legally have to investigate that. The age of consent does not legitimize the provision of strong alcohol to minors. The age of consent does not legitimize minors being plied with strong alcoholic beverages and thereafter, once intoxicated, expected to repay the bartenders for the provision of these strong alcoholic beverages with sexual services. The age of consent does not legitimize underage females, 15, 16 years of age, being trafficked out of the country from Austria to Serbia. The age of consent does not legitimize female minors being trafficked to Serbia for the purpose of sexual exploitation and child prostitution. This officer, in instrumentalizing the age of consent, is breaking so many laws, Austrian laws, under EU jurisdiction and regulation. This is criminal. And furthermore, during the interview, I explained to him how there is a bleed over from the grooming adjacent environment to the school. And there are several incidents that happen under school supervision. For example, when age 15, two students, student E and student N, on an international school trip to Malta, were somehow able to access an adult social environment, a nightclub, were provided with strong alcoholic beverages, and engaged sexually with adult men. Now, the age of consent in Malta is 16, I believe. These children were 15. They were under school supervision, yet they were able to access an adult social environment. They were able to access strong alcoholic beverages, and they were able to fraternize sexually with adult men in their 30s. This is exceptionally criminal, but also it happened under school supervision. And it's not the only time it's happened. It's happened multiple times. International school trip to Italy, 2025. International school trip to Bratislava, Slovakia, 2025. High school prom, 60-year-old security guard employed by the school fraternizing sexually with student E. Criminal, criminal, criminal. And in response to this, the officer said to me, "Oh yes, well, for the school, it would most likely be a fine." Now I respond by saying, okay, but there's not going to be a fine. And he looks at me. Now the reason there's not going to be a fine is because none of this is being logged onto an internal system. This is all off the record. So how is the school probably going to receive a fine when there's going to be no information logged that can even start the investigation to determine whether or not the school is culpable of negligence? But let's be honest, the school would not be receiving a fine for this. This is devastating. This is so serious, it's well beyond a fine. But even if it was just a fine, they're never going to receive one because there's going to be no investigation, because you're not logging this. It's just absolutely astounding that an officer of the law said to me, well, for the school, it would probably just be a fine. Yet we know there's not going to be one. Anyway, as you can see, the Wiener Polizei are facilitating the sexual exploitation of female minors. The state of Austria has the lowest age of consent in Europe. In most European nations, there is a 2-year window between the age of 16 to 18 where a female holding minority status can legally have sexual intercourse with an adult male. Now this is of course exploited by predatory adult men. However, it is very difficult to groom a female between the age of 16 to 18. It's only a 2-year window. Unfortunately, it happens, but grooming occurs incrementally and slowly. So it's very difficult to, for example, normalize, adultify, transactionalize in a 2-year period, all in anticipation of the legal threshold being crossed on the day these females turn 18, by which point they're transactionalized and primed for sexual exploitation, prostitution, sex trafficking, etc. And it can be, and thereafter it can be reframed as relational. There is no legal obligation to protect them. It's very difficult to do that between the age of 16 to 18. In Austria, by having the age of consent at 14, you've increased that window by 100%. And in Austria, you basically presented the optimal window for grooming. Between 14 to 18, the state of Austria is rendering all females between the age of 14 to 18 exceptionally vulnerable to sexual exploitation and grooming. That is psychological conditioning for the purpose of sexual exploitation. It is the optimal window for several grooming trajectories, including late-stage grooming curve escalation, which is what I've identified myself as being the trajectory used currently in the 22nd district at this local bar. So the state of Austria is placing its young females between the ages of 14 to 18 at exceptional high risk of sexual exploitation, yet the framework to protect them from sexual exploitation, the KJH, Kinderschutz, the Polizei, education safeguarding framework, all of these systems are absolutely abysmal. They're so poorly informed, they're not functioning correctly, they're not efficient, individually they're failing, but also these systems are all supposed to converge and communicate, intra-organizational communication, and yet they're not doing so. And then you literally have the Polizei who are corrupt. The Polizei are literally contravening Austrian law in order to reframe sexual exploitation as legal. This is absolutely astounding. And this isn't just municipal level, this is state level. The state of Austria, your systems to protect children between the ages of 14 to 18 are failing. Meanwhile, you're placing them at critical risk by having such a large window between the ages of 14 to 18, where legally they can engage sexually with adult men, and yet they hold minority status. That's a 4-year window for adult men to psychologically condition them, groom them, in anticipation of the legal threshold being crossed on the day they turn 18. So you incrementally transactionalize a teenage girl from the age of 14. By the time she's 17, by the time she turns 18, she's transactionalized, she's fully groomed, she's fully conditioned, she's adultified. As soon as she turns 18 and there is no legal obligation to protect her, she can engage in prostitution, she can be sex trafficked, she's gone. And that is exactly what's happening right now in the 22nd district of Vienna, but it's probably prevalent across Vienna and prevalent across Austria, because the age of consent in Austria makes absolutely no sense, and it presents the optimal window for predators to engage in predation and sexual exploitation of vulnerable young females through psychological conditioning. And the Polizei literally minimize, compress, reframe, and instrumentalize the age of consent in order to legitimize the sexual exploitation of your female citizens. It is absolutely astounding that this is happening. These systems need to be reformed. There needs to be serious investigations, internal reviews. This is huge. And so I just really hope that I have the support of the people who have been patient enough to sit through these videos, absorb what it is that I'm saying. This issue is not going to disappear. I am not going to disappear. I'm not going to be intimidated. And so I'd just like to thank everybody for your support. This is to be continued.